Your grandparents bought a house working one job. You can't afford rent working two. They didn't work harder than you. They weren't smarter with money. They played a completely different game with completely different rules. It's not about avocado toast. It's not about lazy generations. It's not about personal responsibility. Those explanations feel true because they're easy. But they miss what actually changed. This isn't conspiracy. This isn't doom-scrolling content. This is how the money system was redesigned and why the old playbook now guarantees you lose. Let me show you when the rules changed, who changed them, and what the new rules actually are. This morning, somewhere in Chicago, a 28-year-old software engineer named David Park tapped his phone to buy a $6 coffee. In that fraction of a second, his bank sent an electronic message to the coffee shop's bank. No physical money moved. No cash changed hands. Numbers shifted in two databases. That $6 doesn't exist in any physical form. It's a digital entry representing debt, backed by nothing except collective belief that those digits mean something. Now picture the same transaction 200 years ago. A merchant in 1825 Boston pulls a silver coin from his pocket. It weighs exactly 0.77 ounces of pure silver. The coffeehouse owner bites it, verifying its real metal, checks the weight against his scale, and accepts payment. That coin had intrinsic value. If the government collapsed overnight, the silver could still make jewelry, conduct electricity trade for goods, anywhere on Earth. Two identical purchases. Two completely different universes of value. Here's the paradox. Nobody explains to you Americans are more productive than ever, working longer hours with better technology, generating more economic output per person than any civilization in history. Yet the median American has less purchasing power, less savings, and less chance of homeownership than their parents did with worse jobs and no college degrees. If hard work creates wealth, why does more work produce less result? That question keeps economists employed writing theories. But the answer isn't complicated once you see what changed. Margaret Chen still remembers the exact moment she understood something was broken. She was sitting at her kitchen table in San Jose, 43 years old, 21 years into a nursing career, staring at a single number on her laptop screen. $427,000. That was the median home price in her neighborhood, a neighborhood where she'd rented the same apartment for 11 years. She earned $89,000 annually, well above average. She'd saved $61,000 for a down payment, sacrificing vacations, driving an old Honda packing lunches. And the math still didn't work. The number that broke her wasn't the home price. It was the realization that home prices had increased $94,000 in the past year alone, more than her entire annual salary. She could save every dollar she earned and still fall further behind. Meanwhile, across the country, a different story was unfolding. Thomas Whitfield III sat in his family's Connecticut estate reviewing quarterly statements. He was 31, had never held a traditional job, and his net worth had increased by $2.3 million in the same 12 months that left Margaret Chen further from home ownership. Thomas didn't do anything to earn that money. He didn't build a product, serve a customer, or add value to the economy. He simply owned assets, stocks, real estate index funds, purchased with family wealth. When the Federal Reserve printed $4 trillion during the pandemic, asset prices inflated. Thomas's holdings rose automatically. Margaret's savings account earned 0.4% interest while losing 7% to inflation. Same economy, same year, opposite outcomes. What most people get fundamentally wrong is believing they're playing the same game as their parents. They follow the same advice. Work hard, save money, avoid debt, wait for compound interest. This advice was correct in 1975. In 2026, it's a blueprint for slow-motion poverty. The rules inverted 50 years ago, but the instruction manual never got updated. Here's a one-liner worth remembering. Your grandparents' financial advice is a map to a city that no longer exists. Let me show you what I mean with real numbers. Robert Sullivan was a factory supervisor in Pittsburgh in 1975. He earned $12,500 per year at a steel plant. His wife Patricia stayed home with 3 children. They bought a 3-bedroom house for $28,000, roughly 2.2 times his annual salary. Robert put down 20% from savings accumulated over 4 years and paid off the mortgage in 18 years. When he retired in 1998, that house was worth $95,000. His pension covered his expenses. He never invested in the stock market, never owned rental property, never understood what a mutual fund was. He simply worked, saved, and retired comfortably. Now meet his granddaughter. Jessica Sullivan is 34, has a master's degree in healthcare administration, and earns $78,000 annually in the same Pittsburgh metro area. She's been saving for a house since she was 26. She has $47,000 in her down payment account. The median home in her target neighborhood costs $389,000, exactly 5 times her annual income. With current interest rates, her monthly payment would consume 44% of her take-home pay. She needs a larger down payment to make the math work. But while she saves $800 per month, home prices in her area increase by $100 per month. She's running on a treadmill that moves backward. Robert worked a union job without a college degree and bought a house at 24. Jessica has a graduate degree, earns more in real terms, and may never own property. The question isn't why Jessica failed. The question is, why the same strategy produced opposite results across 2 generations. And here's the second contrarian question that should bother you. If a dollar is a dollar, why did the same house cost 2.2 years of labor in 1975 and 5 years of labor in 2026? The house didn't get bigger. The land didn't get more valuable. The construction didn't improve. Something else changed something about the nature of the dollars themselves. Picture a timeline stretching across your screen. On the left, the year 1825, when money meant metal you could hold. On the right, 2026, when money means numbers in a database. Somewhere in between, a fundamental break occurred. A moment when the entire monetary system was redesigned and nobody asked your permission or explained the new rules. That moment has a specific date. August 15, 1971. What happened that night changed everything, not just for Americans, but for every person on Earth who earns wages, saves money, or dreams of building wealth. But to understand why that date matters, you first need to understand what money actually was for the 5,000 years before it. And I promise you, what you learned in school isn't even close to the full story. For 5,000 years, money had one non-negotiable requirement: it had to be real. When a Roman centurion named Gaius Marius received his annual salary of 225 denarii in the year 100 BC, he held actual silver in his hands. Each coin contained 3.9 grams of pure metal. He could bite it, weigh it, melt it down. If Rome burned tomorrow, that silver would still trade for grain in Egypt, silk in Persia, or cattle in Gaul. The value wasn't in the emperor's face stamped on the coin. The value was in the metal itself. This is commodity money. Money that is valuable because of what it physically is, not because someone declares it valuable. Picture a simple diagram: on one side, a silver coin. On the other side, everything that silver can become: jewelry, mirrors, electrical conductors, medical instruments. The coin's value is anchored to physical reality. No government decree required. This system constrained power in ways modern people don't understand. When Emperor Nero wanted to build his golden palace in 64 AD, he faced a problem. The treasury didn't have enough silver, so Nero did what every desperate ruler eventually tries: he cheated. He reduced the silver content in Roman coins from 3.9 grams to 3.4 grams, minting more coins from the same amount of metal. This is called debasement. It's the ancient equivalent of printing money. But here's what happened next, and this is the crucial part. Roman citizens noticed. Merchants noticed. Foreign traders noticed. Prices rose to compensate for the diluted coins. Nero couldn't simply declare that his cheaper coins held the same value. The market adjusted. Silver content dropped, prices increased, and the emperor's deception produced inflation rather than wealth. The system had a built-in immune response. Cheat the money, and reality pushes back. Marcus Chen, Margaret's grandfather, the one whose granddaughter now can't afford a house in San Jose, understood this instinctively. He immigrated from Taiwan in 1962 with $800 sewn into his coat lining. Not $800 in a bank account. Physical currency he could touch, count, and hide. In his world, money you couldn't hold wasn't fully real. When he saved in things: gold coins, land, a small apartment building in Oakland, bought for $47,000 in 1971. Marcus didn't trust paper promises. He trusted metal and dirt. His instinct was 5,000 years of human wisdom compressed into a single behavior. Now here's the question most people never think to ask. If commodity money worked for 5 millennia, protecting ordinary people from government manipulation, why did we abandon it? The answer begins with a war. When World War I erupted in 1914, European governments faced an impossible math problem. Mobilizing millions of soldiers, manufacturing weapons at industrial scale, feeding entire nations at war, this cost more gold than any treasury possessed. Britain, France, Germany, and Russia all made the same choice. They suspended gold convertibility, meaning citizens could no longer exchange paper currency for metal. This allowed governments to print money beyond their gold reserves. Heinrich Braun was a bank clerk in Munich in 1914, 23 years old, engaged to be married. He had saved 4,000 marks over 5 years, enough for a modest house and a secure future. The mark was backed by gold. Heinrich trusted the currency because the currency was tied to metal. When Germany suspended gold convertibility to finance the war, Heinrich wasn't worried. The government promised convertibility would return after victory. Germany lost. Convertibility never returned. By 1923, Heinrich's 4,000 marks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The government had printed so much currency that a wheelbarrow of cash was worth less than the wheelbarrow. Heinrich's life savings, years of careful work, became wallpaper. People literally papered their walls with worthless marks because the notes were cheaper than actual wallpaper. One liner worth remembering. The difference between money and paper is confidence. Remove confidence and you're left with paper. What most people get wrong about the gold standard is thinking it was abandoned because it didn't work. It was abandoned because it worked too well at constraining government power. Gold convertibility meant politicians couldn't finance wars, welfare programs, or re-election promises by printing currency. They had to tax citizens directly, which was unpopular and limited. The gold standard didn't fail. It was murdered because it prevented powerful people from doing what they wanted. After World War II, the victorious powers created a new monetary system at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 44 nations agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar would remain convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This made the dollar as good as gold and established America as the center of global finance. Visualize it like a wheel with spokes. Every currency connected to the dollar connected to gold. Gold anchored in physical reality. The system worked because foreign governments could exchange their dollars for American gold whenever they wanted. This kept America honest. Print too many dollars, and France or Britain would drain Fort Knox. For 25 years, the system held. Then came Vietnam. Eleanor Whitfield. Thomas. Whitfield III's grandmother attended a dinner party in Greenwich, Connecticut in the summer of 1968. Her husband worked at a major investment bank. The conversation that evening, she later recalled, was unlike anything she'd heard before. Bankers were worried. America was spending billions on Vietnam and billions more on domestic programs, but tax revenue wasn't keeping pace. The Treasury was printing dollars to cover the gap. Foreign governments were noticing. France, in particular, was demanding gold for their accumulated dollars. Charles said we couldn't keep both promises. Eleanor remembered decades later. We couldn't fund the war fund, the Great Society, and maintain gold convertibility. Something would break. She was right. By 1971, foreign governments had requested so much gold that American reserves dropped from 20,000 tons to barely 8,000. At the current rate, Fort Knox would be empty within 2 years. Here's the micro hook, the detail that changes how you see everything after. In the summer of 1971, Britain requested to convert $3 billion into gold. If America honored the request, other nations would rush to convert before the gold ran out. It would be a bank run on the United States Treasury. Nixon had a choice: honor the gold commitment and watch America's reserves vanish, or break the promise. He broke the promise. August 15, 1971, a Sunday evening. Nixon appeared on television and announced the temporary suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Temporary, he said. That was 54 years ago. Think about what this meant. Before August 15th, every dollar was ultimately a claim on gold sitting in a vault. After August 15th, every dollar was a claim on nothing except the government's promise that the paper meant something. The anchor was cut. The wheel now spun freely. But here's the contrarian twist nobody mentions in textbooks. The economy didn't collapse. In fact, the opposite happened. Without gold constraints, the government could print money freely. The economy boomed. Stock markets rose. Credit expanded. For the average American in 1972, life seemed better, not worse. This is why the change persisted. The pain came later, distributed across decades, invisible in any single year. Robert Sullivan, the Pittsburgh factory worker from Part 1, bought his house in 1975 at 2.2 times his annual salary. He benefited from the transition, cheap credit, rising wages, inflating asset values. His granddaughter Jessica inherited the consequences, 5 times income, for the same house, stagnant wages, savings, devoured by inflation. The game changed in 1971. The winners and losers were sorted across generations, but removing the gold anchor was only the first mechanism. The second mechanism, the one that actually multiplies money from nothing, operates every time you walk into a bank. And when you understand how that mechanism works, you'll finally see why working harder and saving more might be the worst financial strategy in the modern economy. The answer involves something called fractional reserve banking. And it explains where money actually comes from. Let me show you where money actually comes from. And I'll warn you now, once you understand this mechanism, you cannot unsee it. Walk into a bank and deposit $1,000. In your mind, the bank puts your cash in a vault, keeps it safe, and returns it when you ask. That's the story we're taught. The reality is completely different. The moment you deposit that $1,000, the bank does something extraordinary. They keep roughly $100 in reserve, sometimes less, and lend out $900 to someone else. That borrower deposits their $900 in another bank. That second bank keeps $90 and lends out $810. The process repeats across the banking system, cascading through institutions. Visualize dominoes falling in slow motion, each one slightly smaller than the last, stretching across an infinite table. Your single deposit of $1,000 creates approximately $10,000 in the banking system. The other $9,000 didn't exist before. No one earned it. No one saved it. No one produced anything to create it. The money was manufactured through the act of lending. This is fractional reserve banking. Money created from nothing but a ledger entry and a promise to repay. Here's the first question that should disturb you. If banks can create money by lending, and lending creates money, what actually backs the dollars in your wallet? The answer is debt. Your dollars are backed by someone else's obligation to repay a loan. The entire money supply is constructed from IOUs stacked on top of IOUs, stretching upward like a tower with no foundation. Raymond Torres spent 31 years teaching high school economics in Phoenix, Arizona. He taught students that banks were intermediaries collecting savings from depositors and lending to borrowers. Safe, simple, stable. When he retired in 2019, a former student who'd become a financial analyst took him to lunch and explained fractional reserve banking in detail. Raymond still remembers staring at his untouched sandwich running the math in his head. "I taught thousands of kids the wrong thing," he told me. "Not because I lied, because I didn't know. Nobody explained how the system actually works. We just repeated what the textbook said." The textbooks aren't wrong exactly. They're incomplete in a way that hides the most important truth. What most people get fundamentally wrong is thinking the Federal Reserve prints money. They don't, or rather that's not the primary way money enters the system. Most new money is created by commercial banks through lending. The Fed simply controls the conditions that make lending easier or harder. When the Fed lowers interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper. More people take loans. More loans mean more money creation. Asset prices rise because there's more money chasing the same house's stocks and goods. When the Fed raises rates, the opposite happens. Lending slows. Money supply tightens. Prices stabilize or fall. This is why the Fed's decisions matter more than any election, any legislation, any policy debate. They control the money spigot. But here's the first micro hook, the mechanism that explains why Margaret Chen falls further behind, while Thomas Whitfield III gets richer without working the Cantillon effect. Named after an 18th century economist, the Cantillon effect describes a simple reality. When new money enters the economy, it doesn't arrive everywhere simultaneously. It enters at specific points through banks, through large corporations, through financial institutions. The people closest to the money spigot receive new dollars first when those dollars still hold full purchasing power. They buy assets. Then those dollars circulate outward, passing through layers of transactions until they finally reach ordinary workers in the form of wages. By then, prices have already risen. The dollars are worth less. Picture water pouring into a pool from one corner. The corner fills first. The opposite end rises last. Everyone is in the same pool, but some people's heads go underwater, while others stay dry. This isn't a bug in the system. It's the system. Pause this video for a moment and think about the last decade. Ask yourself, who was closest to the money when the Fed printed trillions? Jamie Reyes worked as an emergency room nurse in Houston throughout the pandemic. 12-hour shifts, mandatory overtime, patients dying in hallways. She earned $67,000 in 2020, up from $64,000 the previous year, a 4.7% raise that felt like recognition. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve created $4 trillion in new money between March 2020 and December 2021. That money flowed to banks, to corporations, to financial markets. The S&P 500 rose 114% from its pandemic low. Housing prices jumped 34% nationally. Jamie's $67,000 salary, when measured against exploding asset prices, made her poorer. She saved $22,000 during the pandemic hazard pay, overtime stimulus checks. By the time she tried to buy a house in 2022, that $22,000 covered less than 4% of the median Houston home price. Before the pandemic, her savings would have covered 7%. She worked harder than she ever had. She saved more than she ever had. And she fell further behind than she ever had. Now contrast Jamie with Harrison Blake. Harrison is 38, manages a private equity fund in Manhattan, and spent most of 2020 working from his Connecticut home. When the Fed announced unlimited asset purchases in March 2020, Harrison made a single phone call. His fund borrowed $120 million at near-zero interest rates and bought distressed commercial real estate. By 2023, those properties had appreciated 63%. Harrison's personal take from the transaction was $4.2 million. He didn't produce anything. He didn't save anyone. He didn't work harder than Jamie Reyes. He was simply closer to the money spigot. One-liner that should burn. In the modern economy, proximity to money creation matters more than productivity. Here's the second direct question. If the system transfers wealth from workers to asset owners every time the Fed prints money, why don't workers demand change? Because most workers don't understand the mechanism. They see rising prices and blame corporations, blame immigrants, blame the other political party. The actual wealth transfer is invisible, happening through percentage points, through inflation differentials, through the gap between wage growth and asset appreciation. No one hands you a bill. The money simply disappears from your future purchasing power. Remember Robert Sullivan from Part 1, the Pittsburgh factory worker who bought a house at 2.2 times his salary in 1975. His wages grew 6.2% annually through the late 1970s, while inflation ran 7.4%. He was losing purchasing power too, but his house appreciated 9% annually. The asset protected him. His granddaughter Jessica has no asset. She absorbs the loss with nothing to offset it. The second micro hook arrives here at the intersection of mechanism and outrage. In 1965, the average CEO of a major American company earned 20 times the average worker's salary, a ratio that existed across most of capitalist history. The boss made more, but within comprehensible bounds. By 2024, the average CEO earns 344 times the average worker's salary. Let that number sit for a moment. 344 to 1. This explosion didn't happen because CEOs became 17 times more talented. It happened because CEO compensation shifted from salary to stock options. Stock options gain value when stock prices rise. Stock prices rise when the Fed prints money and corporations buy back shares. The mechanism connects directly to monetary policy. Victoria Simmons has cleaned offices in the Bank of America Tower in Charlotte, North Carolina for 19 years. She earns $14.50 per hour, roughly $30,000 annually. In 2023, Bank of America's CEO received $29 million in total compensation, 967 times Victoria's salary. The same year, Bank of America received billions in Fed liquidity support and bought back $3.5 billion in stock, boosting the share price that determines the CEO's options value. Victoria empties his trash can. Her labor is essential. The building couldn't function without cleaning staff. His compensation is partially funded by money creation that dilutes Victoria's purchasing power. This is the rage moment. This is what the system actually does. And here's the contrarian twist that might make you uncomfortable. None of this is illegal. None of it violates any rule. The system is working exactly as designed. The designers simply didn't design it for people like Victoria, or Jamie, or Jessica, or Margaret Chen. They designed it for people like Harrison Blake and Thomas Whitfield III. One more one-liner to carry forward. The economy isn't broken. It's fixed in favor of those who fixed it. Linda Nakamura spent 34 years as a financial journalist in New York. She covered the Fed, interviewed chairmen, reported on monetary policy. When she retired in 2021, she wrote a private letter to her daughter explaining what she'd learned. The public story, she wrote, is that the Fed manages the economy for everyone's benefit. The real story is that the Fed manages the money supply in ways that protect the banking system and inflate asset prices. When those goals conflict with working people's interests, working people lose. Every single time. I reported on this for 3 decades. I watched it happen in slow motion, and I never wrote it plainly because my editors wouldn't publish it, and my sources would stop talking to me. That letter was never meant to be public. Linda's daughter shared it with me after her mother passed away in 2023. It sits in my desk drawer, a reminder that even people inside the system understand what it actually does. The question isn't whether the wealth transfer is real. The question is what comes next. Because fractional reserve banking and the Cantillon effect have been operating for 50 years. The compounding has reached a breaking point. When the top 1% owned 23% of wealth in 1970 and own 32% today, When housing costs 5 times income instead of 2. When a generation of workers will never afford retirement, the system approaches limits that mathematics, not politics, will enforce. What happens when enough people realize the game is rigged? What happens when the gap between asset owners and everyone else becomes impossible to ignore? The answer is already playing out, and the consequences stretch decades into the future. Economies don't collapse like buildings. They decay like teeth, slowly and visibly, painlessly at first. Until one morning you wake up and realize the damage is irreversible. This is the story of the next 10 years. Not prediction, projection. The math playing out across time, across lives, across the widening chasm between those who understood the new rules and those who kept playing the old game. Let me show you 2 futures unfolding simultaneously in the same country. The year is 2035. Jessica Sullivan. Robert Sullivan's granddaughter from Part 1. The healthcare administrator who couldn't afford a Pittsburgh house at 34 is now 44 years old. She never bought that house. By 2028, prices had risen another 31%, while her savings grew 12%. The gap widened until she stopped calculating. She rents a 2-bedroom apartment for $2,400 monthly, roughly 34% of her take-home pay. Her retirement account shows $127,000, not bad, except inflation has averaged 4.8% annually since 2025, meaning her purchasing power peaked in 2029 and has declined ever since. Jessica will work until 72. Not by choice. By mathematics. She did everything right. Master's degree. Stable career. Consistent saving. 20 years of discipline. The strategy that built her grandfather's comfortable retirement delivered her to permanent financial precarity. Now meet someone who started in the same year with the same income but different knowledge. Daniel Okonkwo was 33 in 2025, earning $81,000 as a logistics manager in Atlanta, almost identical to Jessica's salary. But Daniel understood something Jessica didn't. He understood that saving currency meant losing purchasing power. He understood that debt used strategically transfers wealth from future inflated dollars to present real assets. In 2026, Daniel bought a duplex for $340,000 with 5% down. He rented one unit, lived in the other, and used the rental income to cover most of his mortgage. In 2029, he refinanced, pulled out $80,000 in equity, and bought a second property. By 2035, Daniel owns 3 rental properties worth a combined $1.4 million. His net worth exceeds $600,000. His rental income covers his housing costs entirely. Same starting point. Same decade. Opposite trajectories. What most people get wrong about wealth inequality is thinking it results from different effort or different talent. Sometimes it does. More often it results from different understanding of how money actually works. Daniel didn't work harder than Jessica. He simply played the game that exists instead of the game he was taught. Here's the first direct question. If the rules favor asset owners, why don't schools teach asset acquisition? The answer is uncomfortable. Schools were designed in the industrial era to produce workers, not owners. Workers need to read instructions, follow schedules, and trust authority. Owners need to understand leverage, capital allocation, and monetary policy. The curriculum never updated because the people designing curricula aren't the people who benefit from financially literate populations. Picture 2 lines on a graph stretching from 2025 to 2035. One line represents wages growing slowly, roughly 2.8% annually, constrained by productivity and global competition. The other line represents asset prices growing 6.4% annually, fueled by money creation and credit expansion. The gap between these lines is the transfer mechanism. Every year, workers fall slightly further behind. No single year feels catastrophic. But compound the difference over a decade, and you've transferred trillions from labor to capital. This is how empires hollow out. Not with a bang, with a spreadsheet. Japan offers a preview of where this trajectory leads. Kenji Yamamoto was 28 in 1989, working as a salaryman at a Tokyo electronics company. Japan's economy was booming. Asset prices seemed to only go up. Kenji saved diligently, planning to buy an apartment in a few years when he'd accumulated enough for a down payment. Then the bubble burst. The Nikkei stock index crashed 80%. Real estate prices collapsed 70% and didn't recover for 3 decades. You might think the crash helped buyers like Kenji. Prices fell, so houses became affordable, right? Here's the first contrarian twist. The crash made everything worse for workers. When asset prices collapsed, banks stopped lending. Without credit expansion, money supply contracted. Companies froze wages, then cut them. Deflation set in. Kenji's savings held their value, but his income dropped. The apartment he wanted cost less, but his ability to qualify for a mortgage disappeared. Japan entered what economists call a balance sheet recession, where the economy stagnates for decades because everyone is paying down debt instead of spending. Kenji is 64 now. He never bought property. He never married. He works the same job for effectively the same inflation-adjusted salary that he earned in 1994. 3 decades of stagnation visible only in retrospect. The one-liner that captures Japan's lesson: collapse isn't the danger. Permanent stagnation is. America in 2035 isn't Japan. The Fed has shown it will print unlimited money to prevent deflation. But that choice creates different damage. The slow erosion Jamie Reyes experienced. The wealth transfer. Victoria Simmons subsidizes the generational gap between Robert Sullivan's retirement and his granddaughter's endless work. The system doesn't crash. It grinds. Let me show you another contrast, this one across borders. Maria Gonzalez grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, watching her parents navigate currency chaos. The peso collapsed in 1989, again in 2001, again in 2018, again in 2023. Each collapse taught the same lesson. Paper currency is a government promise, and governments break promises. By the time Maria was 30, she automatically converted every paycheck to dollar-stored savings in physical goods and trusted no financial institution completely. When she moved to Miami in 2022, she carried that instinct with her, while her American coworkers kept savings in bank accounts, earning 0.5% interest. Maria bought gold coins, invested in dividend-paying stocks, and maintained accounts in 3 currencies. Her American colleagues thought she was paranoid. She thought they were naive. By 2035, Maria's paranoia looks like wisdom. Her diversified holdings preserved purchasing power through the inflation spike of 2027 to 2029. Her American co-workers' savings accounts lost 23% of real value in the same period. Here's the second direct question. Why do Americans trust a system that citizens of other countries recognize as dangerous? Because Americans have never experienced currency failure in living memory. The dollar's dominance since 1944 created 3 generations who believe dollars are inherently safe. This belief is historically anomalous. Every other major economy has experienced currency crisis within the past 50 years. America's immunity isn't guaranteed. It's a streak that hasn't yet ended. The second micro hook lands here. What happens when the streak ends? Remember Heinrich Braun from Part 2, the German bank clerk whose 4,000 marks became worthless by 1923. He didn't see the collapse coming because he'd never experienced one. The mark had been stable his entire life. He trusted the system because the system had always worked. His great-grandson, Werner Braun, is now a financial advisor in Frankfurt. He tells every client the same thing. My family lost everything because my great-grandfather believed currency was safe. I will never make that mistake. Neither should you. American financial advisors give the opposite counsel. They recommend keeping emergency funds in dollars, maximizing 401k contributions to tax-advantaged accounts denominated in dollars, trusting the system that has worked for 80 years. Who's right depends on whether the next 80 years resemble the last 80. And there's no guarantee they will. Picture a timeline stretching from 2025 to 2055, 30 years of full working career. On this timeline, mark the major monetary disruptions, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2020 pandemic response, the 2027 inflation spike not yet occurred, but mathematically likely given debt trajectories. Each disruption required more intervention than the last. Each intervention created more debt. Each debt load demands more future intervention to service. The system doesn't collapse. It escalates. Each crisis becomes the justification for measures that make the next crisis worse. Thomas Whitfield III, the inheritor from Part 1, who gained $2.3 million without working, will be worth approximately $14 million by 2035, assuming his assets appreciate at historical rates. His children will inherit that wealth, invested in more assets, and continue compounding. Meanwhile, Victoria Simmons, the Bank of America cleaning staff from Part 3, will have accumulated roughly $47,000 in retirement savings by 2035. At her current trajectory, she will work until she physically cannot then depend on Social Security that replaces approximately 38% of her pre-retirement income. Two people. Same economy. Same decade. One builds dynastic wealth. One builds nothing. Here's the second contrarian twist. Victoria's situation isn't a policy failure. It's a policy success for the people who designed the policy. The system produces exactly the outcomes it was structured to produce. Asset owners gain. Workers lose. Wealth concentrates. And the process continues until something breaks. The second one-liner to carry forward slow collapse is still collapse. It just takes longer to notice. So what breaks? When does the math become unsustainable? And what happens to people caught in the transition? The answers depend on understanding something most people ignore entirely: the relationship between money energy and physical reality. Because digital dollars can be created infinitely, the resources those dollars claim cannot. And that constraint is where the modern economy meets its limit. Let me bring you back to where we started. This morning, a 28-year-old software engineer in Chicago tapped his phone and bought a $6 coffee. Numbers moved between databases. Nothing physical changed hands. That transaction, repeated billions of times daily across the modern economy, operates on pure faith in a system most people never examine. David Park is real. I changed his name, but his situation isn't invented. He earns $94,000 annually, has $31,000 in savings, $67,000 in student debt, and has never seriously considered buying property because the math seems impossible. When I explained fractional reserve banking to him, how his deposit multiplies through lending, how money is created from debt, how the Cantillon effect transfers wealth upward, he was quiet for a long time. "I have a computer science degree," he finally said. "I took economics in college. Nobody explained any of this. Why didn't anyone explain this?" That question haunted me while making this video. Why don't we teach how money actually works? The answer, I think, is that the system functions better when participants don't examine it too closely. Faith requires a certain blindness. Question the mechanism, and the mechanism becomes visible. Once visible, it becomes questionable. Once questioned, the faith wavers. But here's the contrarian twist that should give you hope. Understanding the system doesn't require you to abandon it. You still need dollars to function. You still participate in the economy. Knowledge doesn't demand revolution. It enables navigation. Picture a river with a strong current. Most people swim against it, exhausting themselves, making no progress. A few people study the current, find the eddies and channels, and use the river's own force to move forward. Same water, same swimmer, different relationship to the flow. Let me revisit Margaret Chen, the San Jose nurse from Part 1, who discovered that home prices were rising faster than she could save. I spoke with Margaret again last month. Something had changed. After our first conversation, she spent 3 months studying the concepts we've covered in this video: fractional reserve banking, the Cantillon effect, asset versus currency, the difference between the old economy and the modern economy. She didn't find secret knowledge. Everything is public information hiding in plain sight. In January 2025, Margaret made a decision. She stopped trying to save her way to a down payment. Instead, she partnered with her sister and brother-in-law, combined their resources, and bought a small triplex in Sacramento, less expensive than San Jose, strong rental demand, cash flow positive from month 1. Margaret lives in one unit. The rental income from the other two covers most of the mortgage. She's not wealthy, she's not secure. But she's no longer running backward on a treadmill. I stopped playing the game I was taught, she told me. I started playing the game that exists. The first direct question for you: what game are you playing? The one you were taught or the one that exists? I want to be careful here. This is not financial advice. I don't know your situation, your risk tolerance, your obligations. What works for Margaret Chen might destroy someone else. The specifics matter enormously, and I'm not qualified to guide your specifics. But I can offer a framework: 3 questions to ask yourself that have nothing to do with investment strategies and everything to do with understanding your position in the system. First, what percentage of my wealth exists as currency versus assets? Currency loses value by design in the modern economy. Assets tend to appreciate. The ratio tells you which side of the transfer mechanism you're on. Second, am I making decisions based on how money worked for my parents or how money works now? The rules changed in 1971. Advice from before the change may be precisely wrong today. Third, who benefits when I follow conventional financial wisdom? If the answer isn't primarily me, that wisdom deserves scrutiny. These questions don't tell you what to do. They help you see where you stand. Remember Victoria Simmons from Part 3, the woman who cleans offices in the Bank of America Tower while the CEO earns 967 times her salary? I think about her often. She's not stupid. She's not lazy. She works harder physically than most executives ever will. But she entered the economy without understanding its rules, and the economy has extracted value from her labor for 19 years while returning subsistence. Victoria isn't watching this video. She works nights, sleeps days, and doesn't have time for YouTube economics content. The people most exploited by the system are often the least able to study it. That's not accident. That's design. Here's the second direct question, the uncomfortable one. If you understand something Victoria doesn't, what obligation does that create? I don't have an answer, but the question matters. Let me pull the threads together. We've traveled from a coffee transaction in 2026, back to Roman silver coins, through the gold standard and its destruction through fractional reserve banking, and the Cantillon effect through Japan's lost decades, and Argentina's currency chaos through the diverging trajectories of Jessica Sullivan and Daniel Okonkwo, Victoria Simmons, and Thomas Whitfield III. The pattern repeats across every example. Systems designed by powerful people serve powerful people. Understanding the system doesn't guarantee success, but misunderstanding it guarantees exploitation. Heinrich Braun lost everything in 1923 because he trusted a currency that betrayed him. His great-grandson Werner learned from that loss and built a career warning others. Knowledge transferred across generations became protection. You are receiving that same knowledge now. What you do with it is your choice. One-liner to remember. The economy isn't a natural phenomenon. It's a designed system, and designed systems can be understood. I want to re-anchor before closing. This video wasn't meant to predict the future. I don't know when the next crisis comes, what form it takes, or how severe the damage will be. Anyone claiming certainty is selling something. The goal was simpler: to explain how the modern economy actually operates, why it differs fundamentally from the economy your grandparents navigated, and what that means for how you think about money, work, and wealth. The signature line that captures everything we've covered. Your grandparents played one game. You're playing another. Same board, different rules. Whether you win or lose depends largely on whether you understand which game you're actually in. Raymond Torres, the retired economics teacher from Part 3, who realized he'd taught the wrong thing for 30 years, sent me an email after reviewing an early draft of this script. One line stood out. "I spent my career explaining the economy I learned in textbooks," he wrote. "I wish someone had explained the economy that actually exists. My students deserved better, so does yours." He's right. You do deserve better. Not better luck, not better circumstances, better information. The economy isn't a mysterious force beyond comprehension. It's a system with rules, with history, with mechanisms that can be studied and understood. Those who understand it navigate it successfully. Those who don't become its fuel. Which will you be? The game changed 50 years ago. The players who noticed have been winning ever since. The players who didn't have been wondering why hard work and good intentions aren't enough. Now you know what changed. Now you see the rules. The only question left is what you do next.